The vibration in my pocket was constant, a rhythmic, buzzing reminder of the bridge I had just burned behind me. I didn't even need to look at the screen to know who it was. Pierce, my only son, my legacy. Or at least, the man I had spent 35 years convincing myself was my legacy. Beside me, the Atlantic Ocean stretched out into a bruised purple horizon, the luxury cruise liner cutting through the waves with a grace I hadn't felt in a decade. My wife, Evelyn, reached over and placed her hand on mine. She didn't ask me to answer it. She didn't ask if I was sure. She just squeezed my fingers, her wedding ring, the one I'd bought her with my first real commission check, catching the fading sunlight. "Nindy 7 calls. Sterling," she whispered, her voice a mix of awe and a strange, quiet satisfaction. "Are you going to let him hit 100? "I'm going to let him hit as many as it takes for the realization to sink in," I replied. I felt a coldness in my chest that shouldn't have been there. Not after 40 years of marriage and a life built on grit, but Pierce had put it there. He and that woman he married. Exactly 72 hours ago, I was the chairman of Vanguard Heavy Systems. Today, I was a ghost with $6 million in a fresh offshore account and a wife who finally had the husband she deserved, instead of the man who was married to a boardroom. Pierce thought he had outsmarted the old man. He thought he had relegated me to the scrap heap of history like a rusted-out excavator. What he didn't realize was that I was the one who built the scrap heap, and I knew exactly which bolts held the whole thing together. I wasn't born with a silver spoon. I was born in the soot-stained shadow of the Pennsylvania steel mills. My father was a man of iron and silence, who worked until his lungs turned to charcoal. I was the middle of 5 boys, and we learned early that if you didn't grab what you wanted from the world would happily let you starve. I moved to Philadelphia at 19 with nothing but a toolbox and a stubborn refusal to die poor. I worked 3 jobs, a night shift mechanic, a daytime hauler, and a weekend laborer. I saved every penny, eating cold beans out of a can so I could buy my first backhoe. I met Evelyn at a roadside diner in Mukngin. She was a waitress with a smile that could stop a riot and a mind sharper than a razor. I spent my last $5 on a steak I couldn't afford just to talk to her for 10 minutes. 8 months later, we were married in a courthouse with 2 witnesses we'd met in the hallway. We built Vanguard together. While I was out in the mud and the grease, Evelyn was at the kitchen table with a ledger, tracking every gallon of diesel and every cent of interest. We grew from 1 machine to 5, then 10, then a fleet that serviced the entire East Coast. By the time I was 50, Vanguard Heavy Systems was a $50 million empire. And then there was Pierce. I wanted him to have the world I never had. I sent him to the best private academies in New England. I paid for the Ivy League education. I bought him his first car, a brand new European sedan, the day he turned 16. I thought I was giving him a head start. In reality, I was ensuring he never developed the calluses necessary to hold on to what I'd built. Pierce grew up in the light, never knowing what it was like to work in the dark. He saw the company not as a living, breathing thing made of sweat and loyalty, but as an ATM with his name on the glass. 3 years ago, he brought Sloane into our lives. She was old money from a family that had lost its fortune, but kept its arrogance. She had a voice like honey and eyes like dry ice. Evelyn saw it first. She told me, "Sterling, that girl doesn't see a husband in Pierce. She sees a promotion." I defended them. I wanted to be the benevolent patriarch. I wanted to believe my son had found a partner who would help him lead Vanguard into the next century. But Sloane didn't want to lead. She wanted to harvest. The shift was subtle at first. Sloane started showing up at the office, offering consultation on our brand identity. Then she started whispering in Pierce's ear about modernizing our operations. Suddenly, the men who had been with me for 30 years, men who had bled for this company, were being referred to as legacy overhead. In meetings, Pierce started talking over me. He'd use phrases Sloane had clearly coached him on: disruptive innovation, agile restructuring, sunsetting the founding era. 2 months ago, the mask finally slipped. They walked into my office on a Tuesday afternoon. Pierce looked uncomfortable, adjusting the cuffs of his $1,000 suit, but Sloane stood like a statue, her hand resting firmly on his shoulder. "Dad, we need to talk about the transition," Pierce said. His voice lacks the tremor it should have had. "The transition?" I asked, leaning back in the chair I'd sat in for 3 decades. I wasn't aware I was going anywhere. "Mr. Montgomery," Sloane said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Let's be honest. The industry is moving faster than your generation can keep up with. You've done a magnificent job, truly. You're a legend. But legends belong in history books, not in the day-to-day grind of a modern tech-integrated firm. You're distracted. Your health, your age, it's becoming a liability for the shareholders. I am the shareholder, Sloane, I reminded her. For now, she replied. And that was the moment the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Pierce stepped forward, laying a thick manila folder on my desk. We've had our legal team, Silas Vane's firm, look over the corporate structure. There are some significant vulnerabilities, Dad. Tax liabilities from the way you handled the Hangin Lamwe High expansion. If the IRS digs in, the whole family loses everything. We've drafted a reorganization plan. It protects the assets by transferring the voting shares to me. You'd stay on as chairman emeritus. A title, a pension, and all the golf you can handle. I looked at my son. I looked for a flicker of shame, a hint of the boy I'd taught to fish on the Chesapeake Bay. There was nothing but a cold, desperate ambition fueled by the woman standing behind him. You want me to sign over the keys to the kingdom because you're worried about my health? I asked. It's for your own good, Sterling. Sloane added. Think of Evelyn. Don't you want to spend your remaining years with her instead of fighting over union contracts and equipment depreciation? I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch until Pierce started to sweat. Leave the papers, I said finally. I'll review them. Sloane's eyes flashed with a momentary victory. Friday, Sterling. Silas Vane has a notary coming to his office at 10 a.m. Don't be late. It's time to let the professionals take it from here. They left, and for the first time in my life, I felt the walls of my own office closing in on me. I opened the folder. I didn't need a lawyer to tell me what I was looking at. Page 15 was the death warrant, a total, irrevocable transfer of all assets. And page 32? The consideration clause. I was selling the sweat of my brow, the blood of my youth, and the future of my family for exactly $1. I felt a surge of nausea so strong I had to grip the edge of the desk. My own son was trying to legally rob me. He wasn't even waiting for me to die. He was trying to bury me alive. That night, I didn't go home to Evelyn right away. I sat in my car in the parking lot, watching the lights of the warehouse flicker. I watched the night shift workers, men I knew by name, men whose kids' college funds I'd helped vet go about their business, unaware that the boy they'd watched grow up was about to sell their futures out from under them. When I finally got home, Evelyn didn't have to ask. She saw the folder in my hand and the look in my eyes. They did it, didn't they? They think I'm a relic, Evie. They think I'm a burden. She took the folder, flipped to the signature page, and saw the dollar amount. She didn't cry. Evelyn wasn't a crier. She looked at me with a ferocity that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with her in that diner 40 years ago. What are we going to do, Sterling? She asked. I'm going to give them exactly what they asked for, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. I'm going to sign, but I'm going to sign a version of the future they never saw coming. I spent the next 48 hours in a fever dream of strategy. I wasn't just a mechanic, I was a builder. I knew how to dismantle a machine as well as I knew how to put one together. I called in every favor. I contacted Arthur Penhaligon, a man who owed me his career and didn't care for the sharks like Silas Vane. I made 3 phone calls to competitors who had been trying to buy me out for years, groups I'd always turned down because I wanted Pierce to have the throne. But Pierce didn't want the throne. He wanted a shortcut. By Thursday night, the trap was set. The documents Pierce had sent me were sitting on my desk, unsigned. But another set of documents, the real ones, were already being couriered across the city. I didn't know it yet, but by the time Friday morning rolled around, I would be the most hated man in my son's life, and the most liberated man in the world. I just had to wait for the first domino to fall. Friday morning arrived with a sky the color of a galvanized steel bucket. I dressed with a precision I hadn't felt since my wedding day. I chose my best charcoal suit, bespoke, tailored in London, and paid for with a single year's profit from the Hangin Lamwe Tham Highway expansion project. As I tightened my silk tie, I caught my reflection. I didn't see a relic. I saw a man who had survived the Hangin Le Tham crash, 3 union strikes, and the brutal winter of Jinmui Sao that nearly buried my first warehouse in snow and debt. Evelyn was already in the kitchen, her suitcase standing by the door like a silent sentinel. We hadn't told anyone our destination, not the neighbors, not my brothers, and certainly not Pierce. The secret felt like a heavy stone in my pocket, but it was the only thing keeping me upright. "You ready, Sterling?" she asked, handing me a travel mug of black coffee. No cream, no sugar, just like the days when we lived in a trailer behind the first yard. "I've been ready for 3 years, Evie," I said. "I just didn't know it until this week. I should have seen it coming. I really should have." The signs were there, scattered like breadcrumbs leading to a trap. It started at the engagement party at the Kensington Hotel. Sloane's father, Harrison, a man who had inherited a textile fortune and never spent a day with grease under his fingernails, had looked at my hands during the toast. He didn't say anything, but the way he smirked at his daughter told me everything I needed to know. I was the new money help who happened to own the machinery. Then came the subtle shifts in Pierce. Before Sloane, he was a boy who loved the smell of diesel and the roar of a cold start engine. After their honeymoon in the Maldives, he stopped visiting the shop floor. He traded his work boots for Italian loafers and started talking about brand equity and scalable paradigms. He stopped calling me Dad in the office and started calling me Sterling. I thought it was just him trying to be professional. I didn't realize he was trying to distance himself from the man who had built the ladder he was currently climbing. I remembered a specific afternoon last summer. We were at the yard in North Philly, and one of my oldest operators, Old Man Miller, no relation, just a guy who'd been with me since the beginning, had accidentally nicked a water line. It was a minor fix, a couple of hours of work. Pierce had screamed at him in front of the entire crew. He called him obsolete. He called him a drain on the company's momentum. I had stepped in, of course, but the damage was done. The look on Miller's face, a man who had attended Pierce's 5th birthday party, was one of pure, unadulterated heartbreak. That was the first time I felt the rot, I realized as I sat in the back of the car on the way to the meeting. The company wasn't failing. My son was. The drive to the office of Silas Vane felt like a funeral procession. Silas was a man who specialized in corporate restructuring, which was a polite way of saying he helped rich kids strip mine their parents' legacies. His office was on the bonne-nuit floor of a glass tower that looked down on the city like a predatory bird. When Evelyn and I walked in, the atmosphere was thick with a fake, sanitized professionalism. Pierce was sitting at a glass table that probably cost more than my first 3 trucks combined. Sloane was next to him, tapping away on a tablet, her expression one of bored triumph. Silas Vane stood by the window, a man in a pinstripe suit with a smile that reminded me of a shark circling a bleeding whale. "Sterling, Evelyn, glad you could make it," Silas said, his voice smooth and oily. "I know this is an emotional day, but it's a necessary one, for the stability of the Montgomery name." "Is it?" Evelyn asked, her voice like a whip. She didn't sit down. Neither did I. "Dad, look," Pierce started, standing up and smoothing his jacket. "I know you're upset, but once the papers are signed, you and Mom are set. We've already looked at some villas in Tuscany. We'll take care of everything. You won't have to worry about a single payroll tax or equipment failure ever again." "Because I'll be a chairman emeritus's?" I asked, looking him dead in the eye. "Exactly," Sloane chimed in, finally looking up. "A prestigious title for a prestigious career. Now, if we could just get through the formalities. Silas has a lot of filings to get through before the banks close for the weekend." I looked at the documents spread out on the table. 40 pages of legal jargon designed to turn me into a ghost. I thought back to my meeting with Arthur Penhaligon the day before. Arthur had been my attorney since I incorporated Vanguard in Tamwichin. He was old school, a man who believed a handshake was a contract, and a contract was sacred. When I had shown him the papers Pierce wanted me to sign, Arthur had turned a shade of red I didn't think was biologically possible. "Sterling," he had rasped, "this isn't a reorganization. This is a mugging. They're taking the voting rights, the real estate titles, the intellectual property on the hydraulic patents. They're even taking the name. If you sign this, you couldn't open a lemonade stand with the name Montgomery on it." "I know, Arthur," I had told him. "That's why I need you to find me the Blackwood Group." Arthur had paused. The Blackwood Group were the vultures of the construction world. They were a massive, ruthless conglomerate based out of Chicago that had been trying to hostile take over Vanguard for 5 years. I hated them. They represented everything I despised about big business: no soul, no loyalty, just bottom-line obsession. "You want to sell to Blackwood?" Arthur had asked, shocked. "Sterling, you told them to go to hell 3 times. "I did," I replied, "but that was when I thought I was protecting my son's future. Now, I'm just protecting my wife's peace. Call them, tell them I'm ready to talk. But tell them I have 3 conditions. 1, the price is non-negotiable. 2, The deal has to be closed by Friday at 9 a.m. 3. They have to agree to an immediate personnel optimization the second the ink is dry. Back in Silas Vane's office, the clock on the wall ticked toward Moorlum. I picked up the heavy fountain pen Silas offered me. It felt like a weapon. "You're sure about this, Pierce?" I asked one last time. "Once I sign these, the Vanguard, it changes forever." "I'm sure, Dad," Pierce said, a glimmer of greed in his eyes he couldn't quite hide. "It's time for the new guard to take over." I leaned over the table. I saw Sloane's hand move toward the documents, as if she wanted to grab them the moment I finished. She was already mentally spending the money she thought was coming. She was already planning the galas and the charity boards she would sit on as the wife of the CEO of Montgomery Industries. I signed the first page. Then the second. Pierce and Sloane were practically vibrating with excitement. They thought they were watching me surrender. They thought they were watching an old lion finally lie down and die. I got to page 15, the one that ceded 1% of the capital stock. I signed it with a flourish. Silas Vane smiled, a cold, clinical expression. "Excellent," Silas said. "Now, the final few pages regarding the real estate assets and the ranch." "Oh, I think we're done here," I said, straightening up and capping the pen. "What do you mean?" Sloane asked, her brow furrowing. "There are still 20 pages left." "Those pages are for the transfer of the current Vanguard heavy systems," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face for the first time in months. "But as of Namui Chin this morning, Vanguard Heavy Systems no longer exists. I sold the entire entity, the equipment, the contracts, the patents, and the very ground we're standing on to the Blackwood Group, for $6 million, cash. It's already cleared the escrow." The silence that followed was so absolute you could have heard a pin drop on the thick Berber carpet. Pierce's face went from triumphant to a sickly, pale green. Sloane's jaw actually dropped. You what?" Pierce stammered. "I sold it, son," I said, my voice calm and steady. "To the people you told me were the future of the industry. I figured, if you wanted to work for a modern, agile firm, I'd give you the best one in the country. But since I no longer own the company, those papers I just signed, they're worthless. I just signed over 1% of a shell company with 0 assets and a $1 valuation." I looked at Silas Vane, whose professional mask was finally cracking. "And Silas, you might want to check your email. I believe the new owners have a message for you." As if on cue, Pierce's phone began to scream. Not a vibration, a loud, piercing ringtone that filled the room like an alarm. He looked at the screen. It was the director of operations from the main yard. "Answer it, Pierce," I urged softly. "I think your new bosses want to have a word." He picked up the phone with a trembling hand. He didn't even get a chance to say hello. I could hear the voice on the other end, even from 3 feet away. It was cold, corporate, and final. "What happened next?" I whispered to Evelyn as we turned toward the door. "Is the part they're really going to hate." The color drained from Pierce's face so fast I thought he might actually collapse onto Silas Vane's pristine glass table. He held the phone a few inches from his ear, but the voice of Jax Blackwood, the eldest son of the Blackwood Empire, was loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. It wasn't the voice of a business partner. It was the voice of a man who had just bought a new toy and was already throwing out the old packaging. "Listen closely, Pierce." Jax's voice crackled, cold as a Chicago winter. "I'm at the main yard right now with the transition team. Your father's wire has cleared, and the keys are in my hand. You and your wife are officially terminated, effective 5 minutes ago. Your access codes are wiped, your corporate accounts are frozen, and I've got 2 security guards standing outside your office with cardboard boxes. If you're not here to claim your personal belongings by noon, they're going in the incinerator. Don't bother calling back." The line went dead. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and punctuated only by the frantic clicking of Sloane's heels as she paced the length of the room. "You didn't," she hissed, spinning around to face me. The mask of the sophisticated Kensington Harris had completely disintegrated. Her eyes were wide, glittering with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated venom. "You couldn't have. That company was worth 50 million, sterling. You sold it for 6? You destroyed Pierce's inheritance for a pittance?" "I didn't destroy his inheritance, Sloane," I said, my voice dropping into that low, gravelly tone I used when a contractor tried to shortchange me on a steel order. I rescued my legacy from people who didn't know the value of a dollar because they'd never actually earned one. You were so focused on the 50 million you thought you were going to inherit that you forgot who actually held the pen. Evelyn stepped forward, her hand still resting on my arm, but her posture was as straight as a structural beam. 6 million is more than enough for Sterling and me to live out our days in luxury, Sloane. As for Pierce, he's young, agile, and modern, isn't he? I'm sure he'll have no trouble finding a new position in this fast-paced market you're always talking about. Pierce finally looked up. He looked small. For all the expensive tailoring and the prestigious education, he looked like the 12-year-old boy who had once lied to me about breaking a window in the warehouse. But this wasn't a broken window. This was a broken family. Dad, why? He whispered. We were just trying to protect the future. Whose future? Pierce. From? I asked. Because it wasn't mine, and it certainly wasn't the men's in the yard. You wanted to sunset me. Well, the sun has gone down. I hope you like the dark. I didn't always feel this cold. There was a time when I looked at Pierce and saw the best part of myself. When he was born, I was still working 16-hour days, coming home with grease under my fingernails that no amount of orange soap could scrub away. I would pick him up, careful not to stain his pristine baby clothes, and I'd promise him that he'd never have to work as hard as I did. That was my first mistake. I gave him the world. I gave him St. Jude's Preparatory, then the Harrison School of Business. I bought him the lifestyle of the old money elite because I wanted him to be respected in circles where I was merely tolerated. I thought I was protecting him. I didn't realize I was raising a man who would eventually see my hard work as an embarrassment and my presence as a hurdle. The early warning signs didn't come in a sudden explosion. They arrived in whispers and subtle slights. It was the way Sloane would look at my hands during Sunday dinner, as if my calluses were a contagious disease. It was the way Pierce started correcting my grammar in front of the board members. But the real turning point, the moment the rot became undeniable, was last Thanksgiving. We were at the Montgomery Ranch, a 300-acre spread in the rolling hills of Virginia that Evelyn and I had spent 20 years perfecting. We had invited Sloane's parents, Harrison and Beatrice Kensington. Harrison was a man who spoke in long, winding sentences about lineage and stewardship, despite the fact that his own family's textile mills had gone bankrupt in the 90s. During dinner, Harrison leaned over his wine glass and looked at me with a patronizing tilt of his head. "Sterling," he said, "you've done remarkably well for a man of your background. But Pierce tells me the company is still running on handshake ethics. In the Kensington world, we understand that sentimentality is the enemy of growth. You really should listen to Sloane. She has the vision Pierce needs to truly move the Montgomery name into the elite tier." I looked at Pierce, expecting him to defend me, to remind Harrison that handshake ethics were exactly what had kept Vanguard afloat when the banks were closing in. Instead, Pierce just nodded, his eyes fixed on his plate. "Harrison's right, Dad," Pierce said quietly. "We need to stop thinking like a family business and start thinking like a global entity. Some of the older staff, they're just not a fit for where we're going." "Where exactly are we going, son?" I asked. "To the top," Sloane interrupted, her voice sweet and poisonous. "But we can't get there if we're lugging around dead weight." Dead weight. That was the night I realized I wasn't a father to them anymore. I was an asset to be liquidated. Standing in Silas Vane's office, watching the reality of their situation settle in, I felt a strange sense of mourning. I wasn't mourning the company. Vanguard was just steel and oil. I was mourning the son I thought I had raised. Sloane was on her phone now, her thumb flying across the screen. "Silas, there has to be a way to freeze the sale. A temporary injunction? Fraudulent inducement?" Silas Vane looked at her with a pitying expression. "Sloane, Sterling was the sole owner. He had the right to sell. He didn't induce anything. You and Pierce were the ones who brought him the documents to sign. Legally, he just beat you to the punch. The Blackwood Group's legal team is a pack of wolves. If they've already moved on the transition, it's over." "It's not over," she screamed, her voice cracking. She turned to Pierce, grabbing his arm. "Do something, Pierce. Call your father. Tell him you'll apologize. Tell him anything." Pierce didn't move. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flicker of the old Pierce, the one who used to follow me around the shop with a plastic toy wrench. But then I looked at the man he had become, the man who had stood by while his wife called me a liability. "I already called him, Sloane," Pierce said, his voice hollow. I've called him 97 times in the last hour. He's not answering. And I'm not going to, I said, turning toward the door. Evelyn and I have a car waiting, we have a flight to catch, and a very long cruise ahead of us. Sterling, wait. Pierce stepped toward me, his hand outstretched. You can't just leave us like this. We have the mortgage on the Kensington Heights condo, the lease on the Ferrari, the staff at the house. You're agile, Pierce, I said, repeating his own words back to him like a slow-acting poison. You're a modern leader. I'm sure you've already planned for unforeseen market disruptions. Use that Ivy League education and figure it out. Evelyn and I walked out of the office. We didn't look back. We didn't wait for the elevator. We walked down the hallway, the sound of Sloane's hysterical shouting fading behind the heavy oak doors. When we got to the lobby, the Philadelphia humidity hit me like a physical weight. I took a deep breath, the smell of the city exhaust, hot asphalt, and the distant scent of the river filling my lungs. For the first time in 35 years, I didn't have a schedule. I didn't have a crisis to manage. I didn't have a company to protect. I pulled my phone from my pocket. 98 missed calls. I scrolled through the text messages that were still flooding in. Dad, please answer. This is insane. Sterling, you can't do this to your own blood. I'll sue you, Sterling. I swear to God, I'll take everything you have left. I felt a vibration in my hand. 99. Let's go, Sterling, Evelyn said, gesturing to the black car waiting at the curb. The ship leaves from Miami tomorrow morning. We shouldn't be late. I nodded and climbed into the back seat. As the car pulled away from the glass tower, I looked out the rear window. I could see the silhouette of the building where I had just dismantled my son's life. I knew what was coming next. The Blackwood Group wouldn't just fire them, they would dismantle their reputations. Jax Blackwood played for keeps, and he didn't like legacy hires clogging up his payroll. But there was one thing I hadn't told Pierce, one thing I hadn't even told Evelyn yet. I hadn't just sold the company, I had sold the Montgomery Ranch, the house Pierce grew up in, the stables where he'd learned to ride, the land where I'd planned to be buried. I'd sold it all to a developer who planned to turn the whole thing into a high-end golf resort. Pierce thought he was losing a job. He didn't realize yet that by the time I got back from this cruise, he wouldn't even have a home to crawl back to. I leaned my head back against the leather seat and closed my eyes. The Gene on my screen finally ticked over. More missed calls. I turned the phone off. What happened next, I thought as I felt the car accelerate toward the airport, changed everything. But they won't find out until the first bulldozer hits the driveway on Monday morning. The Miami heat was a thick, fragrant blanket that wrapped around us as we stepped onto the gangway of the Azure Sovereign. It was a vessel of pure, unadulterated opulence, white steel and shimmering glass, designed to make the rest of the world feel like a distant, dusty memory. As we handed our boarding passes to the steward, I felt the final tether to my old life snap. I wasn't Sterling Montgomery, the burden of Vanguard Heavy Systems. I was just a man with a suitcase and a wife who was finally beginning to breathe again. We were led to the Royal Suite, a sprawling space at the ship's prow with a private teak deck and a view of the horizon that felt infinite. Evelyn walked to the railing, her hair catching the sea breeze, and for a moment, she looked 20 years younger. The lines of worry that had etched themselves around her eyes since Pierce married Sloane seemed to soften. "It's so quiet, Sterling," she murmured. "That's the sound of the world moving on without us, Evie," I said, though I knew the world wasn't quiet for everyone. In my pocket, my phone remained off, but I could practically feel it radiating heat from the sheer volume of digital vitriol waiting on the other side of the screen. I walked to the suite's mahogany desk, opened the small, heavy-duty safe, and placed the device inside. I didn't just lock it. I set the code and whispered it to the air, intending to forget it for at least 48 hours. I needed the silence to settle into my bones before I dealt with the fallout. I didn't tell Evelyn the full extent of the financial lockdown I'd initiated. She knew the company was gone, and she knew the ranch was sold, but she didn't know about the surgical strikes I'd made on Pierce and Sloane's personal infrastructure. You see, for years, Pierce had been living on what I called the Montgomery subsidy. It wasn't just his salary as director of operations, which was already triple what any other firm would have paid a man of his experience. It was the discretionary fund. I'd set up a corporate credit line that covered their $5,000 a month condo in Kensington Heights, the leases on their matching European SUVs, and even the advisory fees I paid Sloane for her supposed branding expertise. I had been the architect of their luxury, and on Friday morning, I had become the demolition crew. Before the car had even picked us up for the airport, I had made 3 calls. The first was to Joe Garrett, my head of finance for 25 years. Joe was a man who lived for spreadsheets and loyalty. When I told him to terminate every corporate card associated with Pierce and Sloan, he didn't even ask why. He just said, "Consider it done, Sterling. Do you want me to flag the personal accounts too?" "No," I told him. "Let them keep their personal savings. I want them to see exactly how fast that disappears when the Montgomery engine stops providing the fuel." The second call was to the leasing agency. I'd informed them that the corporate guarantees on the Ferrari and the Range Rover were being withdrawn effective immediately. By Monday morning, those cars would be flagged for repossession if they weren't returned to the lot. The third call was the hardest. It was to the estate manager at the Montgomery Ranch. Silas Blackwood, the man who had bought the land, wanted to begin the optimization of the property on Monday. I had to tell the staff, people who had become like family, that they were being kept on by the new owner, but that the primary residence was being cleared of all former family residents by noon. I didn't want to be cruel, but I knew Sloan. If I gave her an inch, she'd find a way to squat in that house and tie me up in litigation for years. I had to be absolute. I had to be the man the industry feared, the one who didn't negotiate with subpar contractors. The first night on the ship was a dream of cold champagne and starlight. We dined at a table for 2, the sound of a live string quartet drifting through the air. For 3 hours, we talked about everything except Pierce. We talked about our first apartment in the city, the time we almost went bankrupt in Chinwe High, and the way the air smelled in the spring at the ranch. It was a beautiful, fragile peace. But peace is a luxury that men like me are rarely allowed to keep. By Monday morning, as the ship drifted toward the Caribbean, I couldn't resist. The curiosity was a low-grade fever. I walked to the safe, entered the code, and turned the phone on. The device groaned under the weight of the notifications. Mocham bonmui hai missed calls. Ba chamui hai text messages. Numui voicemails. I sat on the edge of the bed, the morning sun streaming through the porthole, and began to scroll. The messages were a psychological map of a man's descent from arrogance to desperation. Monday, Tam, Muilam AM. Dad, there are people here, at the yard. They're saying they're from Blackwood. They won't let me pass the gate. Answer your phone, Sterling. This isn't funny anymore. Monday, Chin, Bamui, AM. Sterling, this is Sloan. I don't know what kind of senile game you're playing, but the bank just declined my card at the florist. The manager said the account is closed. Fix this. Now. Monday, Muimot, Home AM. Dad, Jax Blackwood is in your office. Your office. He told me to leave the building, or he'd have the police escort me out. He said you sold him the equipment and the contracts for a bargain. You're a traitor, Sterling. You betrayed your own blood for a quick check. I felt a twinge of something not regret, but a deep, hollow sadness. Pierce still didn't get it. He thought I'd sold the company for the money. He didn't realize I'd sold it to save it from him. If I'd let him keep it, he would have run Vanguard into the ground within 18 months, and then there would have been nothing left for anyone. I tapped on a voicemail from Pierce. His voice was raw, strained, and stripped of the Ivy League polish he'd spent so much time perfecting. Dad, please, if you're listening to this, call me. The repo guys are at the condo. They're taking the cars. Sloan is. She's losing her mind. We went to the ranch to stay for a few days, to clear our heads, and there's a private property sign on the gate. The guard said the land belongs to a development group now. Where are we supposed to go? Everything we have is tied up in the company. We have $3,000 in our joint checking account, Sterling. That's it. My rent is due on the 1st. Please, Dad, answer me. I closed my eyes. I could picture them standing at the iron gates of the ranch, their designer luggage sitting in the dirt, the only home Pierce had ever truly known locked against him. I knew I should feel like a monster, but all I felt was the memory of Sloan's voice calling me dead weight. The humiliation didn't stop there. I scrolled further down and saw an email from Joe Garrett. Subject: Monday update Sterling. Pierce made a scene at the yard around High. Home PM. He tried to force his way back in to reclaim corporate documents. Jax Blackwood had security restrain him. It was public, Sterling. All the guys saw it. Sloan was screaming at the security team about her lineage. It's all over the local business, social media groups. Someone filmed it on their phone. I'm sending you the link, but honestly, you might want to skip it. I didn't skip it, I clicked the link. The video was shaky, filmed from across the street. There was Pierce, his face purple with rage, being held back by two burly guards in Blackwood uniforms. He looked frantic, disheveled, his tie pulled loose. And there was Sloane, her voice a shrill, piercing siren, shouting about the Kensington family and legal repercussions. The most heartbreaking part wasn't the violence. It was the commentary from the man filming it. I recognized the voice. It was Miller, the operator Pierce had insulted last year. Look at him, Miller's voice chuckled off camera. The prince and princess finally found out the king isn't dead yet. About time someone showed him the door. I turned the phone off. The silence of the suite felt heavier now. I didn't know it yet, but that video was the spark that would turn a family dispute into a public war. Pierce and Sloane weren't going to crawl into a hole and disappear. People like Sloane didn't know how to lose with dignity. They only knew how to burn everything down on the way out. Evelyn walked in from the balcony, her face pale. She'd been on her own tablet, likely seeing the same things I had. "Sterling," she said, her voice trembling. "Pierce is on the news, a local affiliate in Philly. They're doing a segment on the fall of the Montgomery Empire." "So fast?" I asked, though I shouldn't have been surprised. Sloane's father, Harrison Kensington, had friends in the local media. "It's not just the news, Sterling," Evelyn said, handing me the tablet. "He's doing an interview, right now. He's telling them you've had a mental break. He's telling the world that you sold the company in a fit of dementia and abandoned your family." I looked at the screen. There was my son, sitting in a studio chair, looking gaunt and tragic. He wasn't the man who had tried to rob me for $1 anymore. He was the victimized heir, playing the role of a grieving son for the entire city to see. What happened next, I thought, as I watched Pierce wipe a fake tear from his eye on live television, is going to be the most expensive mistake he's ever made. Because I wasn't just a builder of machines, I was a builder of defenses, and I hadn't even shown him my final hand yet. Watching your own son describe your tragic mental decline on the 6 o'clock news is a special kind of poison. It doesn't just burn, it numbs you, layer by layer, until you're sitting in a 5-star suite on the Azure Sovereign feeling like a ghost in your own skin. Pierce looked directly into the camera, his eyes shimmering with practiced moisture, and told the people of Philadelphia that I had become a danger to myself and my legacy. "My father is a great man," Pierce said, his voice cracking with a precision that would have won an Oscar if he wasn't so busy trying to steal my bank account. But the man who sold Vanguard, that wasn't Sterling Montgomery. That was a man lost in the fog of a cognitive crisis. We're doing everything we can to bring him home and restore order to the family. Beside him, Sloane didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She just sat there in a black dress that screamed, "Mourning the living," her hand resting on Pierce's arm like a predator claiming its kill. She was the one who had choreographed this. She knew that in the court of public opinion, a senile old man was much easier to vilify than a hard-working founder. "They're going for a guardianship, Sterling," Evelyn said, her voice steady but her hands shaking as she held the tablet. "They're going to try to have you declared incompetent so they can petition a judge to void the sale to Blackwood." I stood up and walked to the balcony, the salt spray of the Atlantic hitting my face. The ship was moving fast now, cutting through the water at 20 knots, heading toward the Cayman Islands. But my mind was back in that glass tower in Philly, in the boardroom where I had spent half my life. "They can try," I said, the coldness returning to my voice. "But you can't declare a man incompetent just because he's smarter than you." I hadn't spent 40 years in the construction industry without learning how to build a contingency for a contingency. I knew that Sloane and Pierce would strike back, but I hadn't expected them to go for my sanity. It was a low blow, even for them. It was a move designed not just to get the money, but to strip me of my dignity, my rights, and my very identity. I didn't know it yet, but the guardianship move was only the tip of the iceberg. Sloane had a much darker reason for needing that $50 million valuation, and it had nothing to do with modernizing Vanguard. The first hint of the deeper rot came an hour later. My phone, which I had turned back on despite my better judgment, chirped with an encrypted message from Arthur Penhaligon. "Sterling, check your private server. I've uploaded the forensic audit I ran on the advisory fees your son was paying to Sloane's shell company over the last 18 months. It's not just branding, Sterling. It's a siphon." I went to the desk, pulled up my laptop, and entered the 24-digit encryption code. What I saw made my blood run colder than the depths of the ocean beneath us. Over the last year and a half, Pierce had authorized over $4 million in payments to an entity called Kensington Heritage Holdings. On the surface, it looked like high-level consulting fees, but when Arthur dug into the routing numbers, the money wasn't staying in Sloane's pocket. It was going to Silas Vane's private trust, and from there, it was being used to pay off massive high-interest debts held by Harrison Kensington, Sloane's prestigious father. The old money Kensingtons weren't just broke, they were drowning. Harrison had gambled away the last of the family's textile remnants on bad real estate deals in East Asia, and he owed money to people who didn't use lawyers to collect. Sloane hadn't married Pierce because she loved him. She had married him to turn Vanguard into a life raft for her sinking family. "Look at this, Evie," I said, beckoning her over. She read the spreadsheets in silence, her eyes widening as the numbers added up. "They've been stealing from the company for months. This is embezzlement, Sterling. Pierce must have known." "I don't think he did," I said, a bitter taste in my mouth. "I think Sloane convinced him it was tax-efficient wealth transfer. He's always been desperate to impress her. He probably thought he was being a sophisticated husband, while she was treating our company like a personal ATM for her father's gambling debts." This was the modernization Sloane had been talking about. It wasn't about software or agile leadership. It was about stripping the copper from the walls of the house I'd built to pay for her father's failures. Suddenly, the intercom buzzed. It was the ship's concierge. "Mr. Montgomery, I apologize for the interruption, but there are two gentlemen here at the purser's desk. They claim to be legal representatives, and they have a court-ordered summons. They're asking for your location." My heart hammered against my ribs. They were fast. Sloane's father might be a failure, but he still had enough old guard connections to get a judge to sign a temporary emergency order on a Saturday. "Tell them I'm in the middle of a private medical consultation, and I will be down in 20 minutes, I told the concierge. I turned to Evelyn. "They're trying to serve me. If they serve me with a temporary guardianship order on international waters, it creates a jurisdictional nightmare that could freeze our accounts for months." "What do we do?" she asked, her face pale. "We don't get served," I said, "and we give them something else to talk about." I grabbed my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years, a number that belonged to a man named Jax Blackwood. "Montgomery," Jax answered on the first ring. He sounded amused. "I've been watching the news. Your son is quite the performer. He's got half of Philly thinking you're wandering the halls of your house talking to ghosts." "Jax, I'm going to make this very simple for you," I said. "You bought Vanguard for $6 million. We both know it's worth 10 times that, even with the legacy overhead you're currently firing. You got the deal of a lifetime because I wanted it out of my son's hands." "I'm a businessman, Sterling. I don't turn down gifts," Jax replied. "It's about to stop being a gift," I said. "My son and his wife are filing for a guardianship. They're going to try to void the sale based on my mental incapacity. If they win, you lose the yard, the contracts, and the patents. You'll be tied up in litigation for the next 5 years, and Sloane will bleed that company dry before you ever see a dime of profit." There was a long silence on the other end. Jax Blackwood was many things ruthless, cold, and arrogant, but he was also incredibly protective of his investments. He didn't like being played, and he certainly didn't like his property being threatened by a couple of amateurs like Pierce and Sloane. "What are you proposing?" Jax asked, his voice losing its amusement. "I have the forensic evidence of Sloane's embezzlement," I said. $4 million siphoned into the Kensington Trust. I'm going to send it to you. You're the new owner. You have the standing to file criminal charges for corporate theft. You don't need me to be sane to prove that the money is missing. You want me to go after your son?" "No," I said, and it felt like a piece of my heart was being torn out as I said it. "I want you to go after Sloane and her father. Give Pierce a choice. He can testify against his wife and her family, or he can go down as an accomplice. But you do it now, before those lawyers at the purser's desk reach my door." "Consider it done," Jax said. "I'll have my legal team at the district attorney's office in 20 minutes. And Sterling, you might want to stay in your suite. It's about to get very loud back in Philadelphia." I hung up and looked at Evelyn. We stood there, in the center of the most expensive room on the Atlantic, waiting for the world to explode. 5 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Not the polite rap of a steward, but the heavy, authoritative thud of someone with a badge. "Mr. Montgomery, this is Security Chief Garrett. I have 2 men here who need to speak with you regarding a legal filing from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I didn't open the door. Instead, I turned on the suite's television. I navigated to the local Philly news feed. It was a breaking news alert. The female anchor, the same one who had interviewed Pierce only hours ago, looked stunned. "We have a massive development in the Montgomery story," she said, her voice breathless. "Just moments ago, the Blackwood Group, the new owners of Vanguard Heavy Systems, filed a multi-million-dollar criminal complaint against Sloane Kensington Montgomery and her father, Harrison Kensington. Sources say the complaint involves allegations of systemic embezzlement and corporate fraud totaling over $4 million. We are hearing reports that a warrant is currently being drafted for their arrest." The screen cut to a live shot of the Kensington Heights condo, the one I had paid for. There were 3 police cruisers out front, their lights strobing against the glass. I saw Pierce. He was standing on the sidewalk, looking around with a confused, panicked expression as officers escorted a screaming Sloane toward a waiting car. She wasn't wearing the mourning dress anymore. She was wearing a silk robe, her hair a mess, her face contorted in a mask of pure, ugly rage. The knock at my suite door became more insistent. "Mr. Montgomery, please open the door." I walked to the door and opened it. The 2 men in suits, lawyers for Silas Vane, were standing there, holding their manila envelopes. They looked smug, ready to deliver the killing blow to my freedom. "Sterling Montgomery," the lead lawyer asked, stepping forward. "You are here be served with a temporary emergency guardianship order." "You're a little late, boys," I said, pointing to the television screen behind me. "I think your clients are currently being processed at the Most precinct. And unless you want to be added to the list of co-conspirators in a $4 million fraud case, I suggest you get off this ship at the next port." The color left the lawyer's face as he watched the live feed of Sloane being handcuffed. He looked at the envelope in his hand, then back at me. He didn't say another word. He turned and practically ran down the hallway, his partner hot on his heels. Evelyn let out a long, shuddering breath. "Is it over?" "No," I said, watching my son on the screen, standing alone on the sidewalk as the police drove his wife away. Now comes the part where Pierce has to decide who he really is. Because the Blackwood Group isn't going to stop at Sloane. I felt a vibration in my pocket. I pulled out my phone. It was a text from Pierce. "Dad, they took her. They took Sloane. They're saying she stole money. I didn't know, Dad. I swear I didn't know. Help me, please. They're saying I'm next." I looked at the message for a long time. I thought about the dementia interview. I thought about the dollar transfer papers. I thought about the boy who used to follow me with a plastic wrench. "What are you going to do?" Evelyn asked softly. "I'm going to let him sit in that silence for a while," I said. "He needs to learn what happens when you build your house on someone else's lies." But what I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that Sloane's father, Harrison, had one final, desperate card to play. And it was a card that involved a secret I had buried 30 years ago. A secret that could destroy not just Pierce, but the entire Montgomery legacy I was trying to protect. The luxury of the Azure Sovereign suddenly felt like a tomb. The gold leaf moldings, the scent of expensive lilies, the soft hum of the massive engines, it all became background noise to the ringing in my ears. I was sitting in a leather chair by the window, watching a pod of dolphins break the surface of the turquoise water, when the call came through. It wasn't Pierce. It wasn't Jax Blackwood. It was Harrison Kensington, the man who was supposed to be in a holding cell, the man whose daughter was currently being photographed for a mugshot. His voice was different than the condescending drawl I'd heard at Thanksgiving. It was sharp, cold, and possessed a terrifyingly calm clarity. "Sterling," he said, and I could hear the clink of ice against a glass. He wasn't in jail. He was at his club. "You think you've played a very clever hand, don't you? You think siphoning a few $1 million is the end of this story. You've humiliated my daughter. You've threatened my family's name. But you've forgotten one thing, Sterling. Old money doesn't just buy houses. It buys secrets. I have the forensic audits, Harrison," I replied, my voice steady despite the sudden chill in my bones. "Your daughter is a thief, and you're the fence. There's no secret that covers up $4 million in wire fraud." "Oh, I'm not talking about Sloane's little accounting errors," Harrison chuckled, and the sound made the hair on my arms stand up. "I'm talking about Mutngin Chin Chum Chin Muy Bon, the Blackwood Creek expansion. Do you remember that project, Sterling? Or has the dementia Pierce mentioned actually started to set in?" I felt the air leave my lungs. The name of that project hadn't crossed my lips in 3 decades. It was the job that had made Vanguard. It was the contract that took us from a local hauling company to a regional powerhouse. I don't know what you're talking about, I lied. It was a weak lie, and we both knew it. Don't you? Let me refresh your memory. A housing development built over an old industrial site, toxic runoff, soil samples that didn't quite meet the EPA standards of the time. You were desperate, Sterling. You were one bad inspection away from losing the yard, the house, and that trailer you lived in. So, you made a deal. You paid off a surveyor named Garrett Vane, Silas Vane's father, by the way, to sign off on the foundation. You buried those barrels under 6 feet of reinforced concrete and a playground. I gripped the armrest of my chair so hard I thought the wood might snap. That was 30 years ago, Harrison. The statute of limitations doesn't apply to environmental endangerment involving a public school site, Sterling. Not when people start getting sick 30 years later. And certainly not when I have the original, unredacted soil reports in a safety deposit box that Silas Vane's father left to him. If those papers see the light of day, you won't just lose your $6 million. You'll spend the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary. And Evelyn? She signed the ledgers back then, didn't she? She was your bookkeeper. She's an accomplice. He let that sink in. The silence on the line was a physical weight. He wasn't just threatening me. He was threatening the one person I had done everything to protect. What do you want? I whispered. I want the Blackwood sale voided, Harrison said. I want Sloane's charges dropped. I want a public apology from you, admitting that the embezzlement was a misunderstanding. And then, I want you to sign over the remaining Montgomery assets, the offshore accounts, the life insurance policies, to a trust in Pierce's name, a trust that I will manage. You and Evelyn can keep enough for a small apartment in a quiet town, somewhere far away from Philadelphia. You're asking me to hand you my life. I'm asking you to buy your freedom, Sterling. You have 24 hours to call Jax Blackwood and tell him you lied about the fraud. If you don't, the EPA gets a very interesting delivery tomorrow afternoon. Give my love to Evelyn. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my hands shaking. The dolphins were gone. The water was just a vast, empty blue. I didn't know it yet, but this was the moment I hit rock bottom. I had spent my life building things, bridges, buildings, a family only to realize I had built them all on a foundation of sand and a 30-year-old sin. I had tried to play the hero, the righteous father punishing his wayward son, but I was just as dirty as the people I was trying to destroy. Evelyn walked into the room, holding 2 glasses of iced tea. She saw my face and dropped them. The glass shattered on the marble floor, the brown liquid spreading like a stain. Sterling, what is it? Is it Pierce? I looked at her, and for the first time in 40 years, I didn't know if I could save us. I told her. I told her everything I'd kept buried since Motngin Chin Chum Chin Mui Bon. I told her about the barrels, the surveyor, and the deal I'd made in the dark to keep our heads above water. I watched the color drain from her face, watched the pride she'd felt for our triumph over Sloane turn into a cold, paralyzing terror. They'll take everything, won't they? She asked, her voice a ghost of itself. They want to, I said. But Harrison made one mistake. What mistake? He thinks I'm still the man I was in Motngin Chin Chum Chin Mui Bon. He thinks I'm a man who is afraid of losing his status. He thinks I'm afraid of being poor. I stood up, the adrenaline finally starting to drown out the fear. He's forgotten that I started with $50 in a toolbox. I know how to be poor. But I don't think Harrison Kensington has any idea how to be a criminal when the light is actually shining on him. I walked to the safe and pulled out my laptop. I didn't call Jax Blackwood to retract the fraud charges. I called Arthur Penhaligon. Arthur, I said, my voice cracking but firm, I need you to pull the records for the River's Edge project from Chin Mui Bon. Not the ones in our office, the ones at the city archives. And then, I need you to find a man named Silas Vane. Don't talk to him, just find out where he is. Sterling, what's going on? You sound different. I'm going for a walk, Arthur, I said, and I'm bringing a hammer. I realized then that the only way to beat a man who is blackmailing you with the truth is to tell the truth yourself, before he can. I was going to lose the $6 million. I was probably going to lose my freedom. But I was going to make sure that Harrison Kensington went down in the same fire he was trying to light under me. But first, I had to deal with Pierce. I turned my phone back on. I had one message from him. It wasn't a plea for money or an apology. It was a photo. A photo of him sitting in our old kitchen at the ranch. which he had apparently broken into. He was holding a dusty bottle of whiskey I'd been saving for his wedding day, the one he never let me toast him with. The caption read, "You won, Dad. You took it all. I hope the ocean is worth the price of your son." I felt a surge of grief so sharp it felt like a heart attack. Pierce was a fool, a puppet, and a thief, but he was my fool. And if Harrison's plan went through, Pierce would be the one left holding the bag for the environmental disaster, while Harrison and Sloane disappeared with the money. "Evelyn, call the captain," I said. "I need to get off this ship. We're going back to Philadelphia." "Sterling, if we go back, we're walking right into the EPA's hands. Harrison will fulfill his threat the moment we touch American soil." "Let him," I said. "I've spent 30 years hiding from that foundation. It's time to see what's actually underneath it." What happened next was the beginning of my real revenge. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about scorched earth. I wasn't just going to dismantle a company. I was going to dismantle a dynasty. I didn't know it yet, but the Blackwood Creek secret had a second half. A half that Harrison didn't even know about, because Silas Vane's father hadn't just kept a file on me. He'd kept a file on the Kensingtons too, and that file was sitting in the one place Harrison would never think to look, in the hands of the man he had just tried to use as a pawn. I sat down and began to type. It wasn't a retraction, it was a confession, and I was going to send it to the district attorney, the EPA, and the lead anchor of the Philly News at exactly the same time. What happened next? I whispered to the empty room as the ship turned back toward the coast, is the part where the Montgomery name finally becomes what it was always meant to be. Honest. But as I hit save on the draft, a new notification popped up. A breaking news story from Philadelphia. Tragedy at the Montgomery Ranch. Body discovered in the primary residence. My heart stopped. I looked at the photo of Pierce and the whiskey bottle again, the background, the lighting. It wasn't the kitchen. It was the garage. The garage where we kept the old Ford tractor. "Pierce," I gasped, the world spinning. "Oh God, Pierce, what have you done?" The flight from Miami to Philadelphia was a descent into a private circle of hell. Every minute felt like a year. Every vibration of the plane's engines felt like a hammer striking my chest. Evelyn sat beside me, her eyes fixed on the seat back in front of her, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests. We didn't speak. What was there to say? If that news report was what I feared, if the body in the ranch was Pierce, then there was no amount of money or revenge in the world that could fill the void left behind. I kept looking at that photo on my phone. Pierce, the whiskey bottle, and the dark oil-stained floor of the tractor garage. It was the place he used to hide when he was a teenager, the place where he felt most connected to the old version of me. I had been so focused on teaching him a lesson that I had forgotten he was a man who had never been taught how to lose. I had stripped away his ego, his career, and his wife in 72 hours. I had left him with nothing but his own shame. "He's strong, Sterling," Evelyn whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "He's a Montgomery. He wouldn't do that." "I pushed him too hard, Evie," I rasped. "I wanted to break the pride out of him, but I might have broken the man instead." When we landed at PHL, the air was cold and damp, a stark contrast to the tropical warmth we'd left behind. Arthur Penhaligon was waiting for us at the gate, his face grim, flanked by two men in dark suits who didn't look like lawyers. They looked like protection. "Sterling, thank God," Arthur said, taking my hand. "We need to move. Now." "The ranch, Arthur," I demanded, ignoring the formalities. "The news report. Who is it? Is it my son?" Arthur looked at me, then at Evelyn. He took a deep breath. "It's not Pierce, Sterling. The body they found. It wasn't him." The relief that washed over me was so violent I actually stumbled. I had to lean against a concrete pillar to keep from hitting the floor. I wasn't a religious man, but in that moment I offered a silent prayer of thanks to a God I hadn't spoken to in decades. "Then who?" I asked, wiping the cold sweat from my brow. "It was Silas Vane," Arthur said, dropping the name like a lead weight. "He was found in the tractor garage. Head trauma. It looks like a struggle took place. The police have the perimeter cordoned off, but Pierce is in custody for questioning. They found him sitting on the porch of the main house, covered in grease and dust, just waiting for them." My mind raced. Silas Vane, Harrison's legal attack dog, the son of the man who helped me cover up the Blackwood Creek disaster. What was he doing at my ranch in the middle of the night? "We're going there," I said. "Now." The Montgomery Ranch looked like a war zone. Blue and red lights strobed against the white siding of the farmhouse, casting long, jagged shadows across the fields. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the wind, marking the path to the garage. As the car pulled up to the gate, I saw him. Pierce was sitting on the bumper of a police cruiser, wrapped in a gray forensic blanket. He looked smaller than I remembered. His expensive suit was torn at the shoulder, and there was a dark bruise blossoming across his cheekbone. When he saw me step out of the car, he didn't look away. He didn't look angry. He just looked hollow. I pushed past a deputy who tried to stop me. "That's my son," I growled, and the man stepped back. I reached Pierce and stood over him. For a long time we just looked at each other, the chairman and the hair, the ghost and the man who tried to kill him. "You're alive," I said, my voice breaking. "I didn't do it, Dad," Pierce said, his voice a dry whisper. "I didn't kill him. He came for the files. He thought I knew where you kept the Blackwood Creek originals. He had a gun, Dad. He was frantic. He said Harrison was going to kill him if he didn't get those papers back." "A gun?" Evelyn gasped, reaching for Pierce's hand. "He tripped," Pierce said, staring at the ground, in the dark. "He caught his foot on the old hydraulic lift and hit his head on the corner of the tractor blade. I tried to help him, but he was gone before I could even call Chinchamwe Mort." I looked toward the garage, the tractor blade, the same blade I'd used to move the earth 30 years ago. It was a poetic, brutal irony that I couldn't ignore. "Pierce," I said, sitting down next to him, "why did you go to the garage?" He looked at me then, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't the Ivy League arrogance or the Sloan-inspired greed. It was the grit of a Montgomery. "Because I remembered," he said. "I remembered the night in Chinmuibon when you came home covered in that red clay. I was 10. You thought I was asleep, but I watched you from the window. You buried something under the floorboards of that garage, didn't you? Not the barrels. You buried the truth." I felt the world tilt. "What did you find, Pierce?" He reached into the pocket of the forensic blanket and pulled out a small, rusted metal box. It was a fireproof deed box I'd hidden beneath the concrete slab during the Chinwe-Lem renovation. I'd told myself I'd destroyed it, but the coward in me had just buried it deeper. "I found the reason Harrison Kensington has been able to keep his boot on your neck for 30 years, Pierce said. He opened the box. Inside was a single, yellowed document protected by a plastic sleeve. I took it with trembling hands. It wasn't just a soil report. It was a contract of indemnity. It was dated July 1997. It was signed by me, yes. But the other signature, the one that controlled the money, the one that had ordered the expedited disposal of the toxic waste, wasn't mine. It was Harrison Kensington's. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Harrison hadn't been blackmailing me because I was the criminal. He'd been blackmailing me to hide the fact that he was the one who had owned the land before I bought it. He had sold me a poisoned site, forced me to cover it up to keep my business alive, and then used that very cover-up to keep me under his thumb for 3 decades. He had turned me into his silent partner in a crime he had engineered. "He framed you, Dad," Pierce said, a tear finally tracing a path through the dust on his face. "He made you think you were the one who broke the law, but he was the one holding the shovel. He's been using us, all of us, for 30 years. He used Sloan to get into the company so he could finally erase the last of the evidence." I stood up, the rusted box in my hand. The weight of 30 years of guilt suddenly felt lighter, replaced by a cold, incandescent rage. Harrison hadn't just tried to steal my company. He had stolen 30 years of my peace. He had made me live in fear of a ghost that he had created. "Arthur," I barked. Arthur Penhaligon stepped forward. "I'm here, Sterling. Get the district attorney on the phone, not the one Sloan knows. Get the state's attorney, and tell Jax Blackwood to meet us at the Montgomery office in 1 hour. We're not just filing fraud charges anymore." "Sterling, wait," Evelyn said, her eyes wide. "What about the EPA? What about the Chinmuibon site?" "We're going to pay for it, Evie," I said, looking her in the eye. "We're going to use every cent of that $6 million to clean up that site. We're going to be the ones who report it. We're going to take the hit, the fines, and the shame, but we're going to do it on our terms, not Harrison's." I turned back to Pierce. I reached out and put a hand on his shoulder. It was the first time I'd touched him with affection in a long, long time. "You did good, son," I said. "You found the one thing I was too afraid to look for." What happens now, Dad? Now, I said, looking toward the lights of Philadelphia on the horizon. We go and see a man about a dynasty. The final reversal began at Home AM, in the boardroom of Vanguard Heavy Systems. The room was dark, save for the flickering lights of the city outside. Jax Blackwood was there, looking bored and lethal. Arthur was there, his briefcase bursting with the new evidence. And Pierce was there, washed and dressed in a borrowed sweatshirt, sitting at the end of the table. We waited in silence until the doors opened. Harrison Kensington walked in, followed by two lawyers who looked like they'd been pulled out of bed. He still had that arrogant tilt to his head, that old money swagger that suggested he was untouchable. He didn't know about Silas Vane yet. He didn't know the body had been found. Sterling, Harrison sighed, sitting down and checking his gold watch. You're making this very difficult. I told you 24 hours. You have 6 left. Why are we here in the middle of the night? I wanted to show you something, Harrison, I said, sliding the rusted metal box across the table. I found a little piece of history. Harrison looked at the box, then at me. His eyes flickered to the yellowed document inside. For a split second, a fraction of a heartbeat, I saw it. The mask slipped. The old money confidence vanished, replaced by a raw, animal terror. Where did you get that? He whispered. My son found it, I said, nodding toward Pierce. The son you tried to turn against me. The son you tried to use to steal my life's work. It doesn't matter, Harrison snapped, recovering his composure with a sneer. It's a 30-year-old piece of paper, my word against yours, Sterling, and I have the resources to bury you in court for a decade. You don't have Silas Vane anymore, Harrison, I said quietly. Harrison went still. What? He's dead, Harrison. He died at the ranch tonight trying to steal this box. The police are processing the scene as we speak. And do you know what they found in his pocket? A burner phone with 3 calls to your private residence between midnight and Home AM. Harrison's lawyers leaned in, whispering frantically in his ear. The man looked like he was shrinking, the expensive wool of his suit suddenly appearing too large for his frame. I've already sent a copy of this indemnity contract to the state's attorney, I continued, along with the forensic audit of Sloane's consulting fees. It turns out, when you combine murder, or at least a death during the commission of a felony with 30 years of environmental fraud and a $4 million embezzlement scheme, even the Kensington name doesn't carry much weight. Jax Blackwood stood up, leaning his knuckles on the table. And since I now own the company, Harrison, I'm the one filing the civil suit for the damages your daughter caused. I'm going to take every asset the Kensington family has left. The club memberships, the art, the name. By the time I'm done with you, you won't be able to afford a bus ticket out of this city. Harrison looked around the room, his eyes wild. He looked at Pierce, looking for a shred of the puppet he'd manipulated. Pierce, tell them, Harrison pleaded. Tell them it was a mistake. Think of Sloane. She's your wife. Pierce stood up. He walked over to Harrison, leaning down until they were eye to eye. My wife is a thief, Harrison, Pierce said, his voice cold and clear. And you're a ghost. My dad was right. You're just dead weight. The police entered the room then. They didn't even use sirens. They just walked in with the quiet, heavy footsteps of the inevitable. As they led Harrison Kensington out in handcuffs, he didn't scream. He didn't fight. He just looked at me with a hollow, defeated expression. I didn't know it yet, I thought, watching the doors close behind him. But the real revenge wasn't seeing him in chains. It was seeing my son stand up on his own 2 feet. But the story wasn't over. Not quite. Because as Harrison was led away, he turned his head and whispered one last thing to me, a thing that made my heart stop for the second time that night. You think you won, Sterling. Check the offshore account, the one with the 6 million. Sloane wasn't the only one with the password. I lunged for my laptop, my fingers flying across the keys. I logged into the encrypted bank portal in the Caymans. My breath hitched. The balance was 0. What happened next? I whispered, the screen's white light reflecting in my eyes, was the final twist I never saw coming, and it was going to require one last, desperate gamble to survive. The 0 on the screen didn't just represent a loss of currency. It felt like the final heartbeat of the life I had spent 40 years constructing. $6 million, the price of my dignity, my retirement, and my silence, had vanished into the digital ether. Behind me, I could hear Harrison Kensington's dry, rattling laugh as the officers forced him toward the elevator. The Kensingtons always have a back door, Sterling, he shouted, his voice echoing through the hollowed-out remains of my office. "You played the hero, but you're going to die a pauper." The heavy oak doors clicked shut, and the boardroom fell into a silence so thick it felt like physical pressure. Evelyn let out a soft, broken sound, her hand flying to her mouth. Pierce stood frozen, staring at the empty bank portal, as if he could manifest the numbers back into existence through sheer force of will. "It's gone," Pierce whispered. "Dad, everything. The sale, the ranch, it's all for nothing." I stared at that blinking cursor, my vision blurred for a second, the weight of my age and my mistakes finally threatening to pull me under. I had been so sure of my countermove. I had played the game of shadows and corporate warfare, but I had underestimated the sheer, desperate greed of a woman who felt entitled to a world she hadn't built. But then, I felt a familiar sensation. It was the same spark I'd felt in Motngin Chin Cham Tamui Bon when the bank told me I'd never own a backhoe. It was the same cold, calculated fire that had burned in me when I decided to sell Vanguard out from under my own son. I wasn't just a man who owned machines. I was the man who knew how to find the leak in the hydraulic line when the rest of the world was screaming about the flood. "Not yet, Pierce," I said, my voice sounding more like the gravel of a yard than the silk of a boardroom. "Evelyn, sit down. Pierce, give me your phone." "Dad, what are you doing?" I didn't spend 30 years dealing with union lawyers and predatory lenders without learning one universal truth, I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard. "A thief always moves money to the place they feel safest. And Sloane? She doesn't feel safe in a bank. She feels safe in her father's shadow." I didn't tell them that I had expected this. I hadn't known she would take the money, but I had prepared for the possibility that the account password, the one I'd accidentally left in a file on my desktop, would be too tempting to ignore. I had used the 6 million as a digital beacon. I opened a secondary window, a hidden tracking program that Arthur Penhaligon had installed on my laptop weeks ago. It was a honeypot protocol. The money hadn't been stolen in the traditional sense. It had been diverted through a series of shell companies that Arthur and I had been monitoring in real time. "Look," I pointed to the screen. A series of red dots were jumping across a map of the British Virgin Islands, then looping back toward a private server in Kensington Heights. She didn't move it to a new account. She moved it to the Kensington Heritage Trust, the same trust Harrison used for his gambling debts. She thought she was being clever, hiding my money in her family's mess. "But if it's in their trust, we can't touch it," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "It's legally protected." "Not if the trust itself is the subject of a federal racketeering investigation," a new voice said. Jax Blackwood stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, his face a mask of predatory boredom. He was holding a tablet of his own. "Sterling, you really are a piece of work. You used your own retirement fund as bait for a wire fraud trap." "I knew they couldn't help themselves, Jax," I said. "And now, because that money was transferred after the criminal complaint was filed against Sloane, it provides the nexuses the FBI needs to seize the entire Kensington estate, not just my 6 million. Everything." The silence that followed this time was different. It was the silence of a completed structure. The trap had closed. Sloane hadn't just stolen my money. She had provided the final piece of evidence needed to strip her entire lineage of their remaining assets. By trying to rob me one last time, she had effectively bankrupted her own father and herself. The weeks that followed were a blur of depositions, environmental hearings, and the slow, painful process of public atonement. I didn't hide from the Blackwood Creek scandal. As I promised, I used the recovered $6 million, every cent of it, to fund the remediation of the site. I sat in front of the EPA and the local school board, and I told them the truth. I told them I was a man who had let fear make him a criminal 30 years ago, and I was a man who was willing to lose everything to set it right. The Montgomery name was dragged through the mud, just as I knew it would be. The old money elite turned their backs on us. The modern leaders used us as a cautionary tale. But for the first time in 3 decades, when I closed my eyes at night, I wasn't waiting for a ghost to knock on my door. Sloane was sentenced to 7 years for corporate fraud and embezzlement. Harrison Kensington, broken and humiliated, died in a federal medical wing 6 months into his sentence. The Kensington legacy vanished as quickly as a shadow when the sun goes down. But the real story, the one that actually mattered, happened a year later. I was sitting on a small wooden porch of a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It wasn't a 300-acre ranch. It wasn't a glass tower. It was a simple two-bedroom house on a plot of land that was clean, honest, and paid for. Evelyn was inside humming to herself as she organized a kitchen that didn't require a staff to maintain. A dusty, beat-up pickup truck pulled into the gravel driveway. A man stepped out, wearing a pair of grease-stained work pants and a simple cotton shirt. He looked older, more tired, but his eyes were clear. "Hey, Dad," Pierce said, leaning against the truck he'd bought with his own wages from a local construction firm where he was working as a junior surveyor. "You're late," I said, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "The deck isn't going to level itself." Pierce laughed, a real, grounded sound. "The foreman kept me late on the site. We had a bad batch of concrete, and I told them I wasn't signing off on it until it was poured right. I figured you'd appreciate the delay." "I do," I said, "more than you know." Pierce sat on the steps next to me. We didn't talk about Vanguard. We didn't talk about the millions we had lost, or the agile leadership he'd once craved. We talked about the way the soil felt in the spring, and the best way to brace a load-bearing beam. We talked about the things that were built to last. "You know, Dad," Pierce said, looking out over the valley, "I used to think being a Montgomery meant having the biggest office in the city. I thought it meant being the man everyone was afraid of. And what do you think it means now?" "It means being the man who stays until the job is done right," he said. "Even if nobody is watching. Especially if nobody is watching." I reached out and squeezed his shoulder. His muscles were hard, his hands calloused. He was finally a man I could be proud of, not because of the school he attended or the suit he wore, but because of the character he had forged in the fire of his own failure. "I have something for you," I said, reaching into my pocket. I handed him a small, heavy object. It was a key not to a car or a condo, but to a small storage unit in Philly. "What's this?" "In that unit is your grandfather's old toolbox," I said, "and the original ledger from the day your mother and I started Vanguard. I saved them from the sale. I want you to have them, not as a business plan, but as a reminder." Pierce took the key, his fingers tracing the cold metal. "A reminder of what?" "That a legacy isn't something you inherit, Pierce. It's something you earn, one day at a time, with your own two hands. And that respect is the only currency that never devalues." As the sun began to set over the mountains, casting long, golden shadows across our porch, I realized that I had finally achieved the retirement I deserved. It wasn't on a cruise ship with 97 missed calls. It was here, in the quiet, with my wife and my son, watching the world continue to turn. The Montgomery name was no longer on the side of a fleet of trucks. It wasn't on a high rise in the city, but it was written in the soil of a clean site in Blackwood Creek, and it was written in the heart of a man who was finally learning how to be a son. And as I watched Pierce pick up a level and walk toward the unfinished deck, I knew that what nobody knew was the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, you have to burn your entire world down just to see what was worth saving from the ashes. I took a deep breath of the mountain air, leaned back in my chair, and for the first time in 67 years, I let the silence be enough.